Well, welcome to the new and improved COVID-19 Central Alliance Church Shelter in Place Sunday School class. It's a rainy day here in Georgia, and so I'm recording this one inside. Today we're going to be talking about living in the resurrection, how the resurrection of Jesus affects the way we live our lives. And so let's start off with a little bit of a review. First of all, our gospel. According to 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4, the gospel is simply that Jesus died for our sins, that he was buried, and that he rose again on the third day. This is the gospel. And the Grubers were kind enough to send me an article that indicated that if we look at those verses a little bit more closely, we see that Paul says, I delivered unto you what I received. In other words, this was a sense, a creed statement. This was a statement of belief that the early Christians were sharing amongst themselves, and it's how they expressed their faith in Jesus Christ. So this is probably one of the very, very first creeds that was handed down by the apostles. It was delivered unto Paul, and he shared it unto the Corinthians. That Jesus died, he was buried, and he rose again on the third day. We know that this was a bodily resurrection. It left an empty tomb. First, the Gospels tell us that the tomb was empty. But secondly, we have Jesus' words in Luke 24, where he says to the disciples, after he has risen, see my hands and my feet, that it is truly me. Touch me and see, for a spirit doesn't have flesh and bones, as you see that I have. So here he's saying this is not just a spirit rising from a dead body. This is a dead body that has been risen again. And look at those words in red. He says, this is truly me. This goes back to our discussion last week. What constitutes the real person? Is it our soul? Is it our body? Is it the combination of the two? I don't think that we can discount the importance of our physical bodies in identifying who we are. And because of that, it's important for us to see that God is going to honor his original good creation by restoring it in the end. And just as Jesus was bodily raised from the dead, so we will be bodily raised from the dead. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus is the first fruits of those who are asleep. The first fruits, meaning that just as he rose from the dead, we are going to rise from the dead. Keep in mind that in the first century, the Jews were expecting a bodily resurrection of all humanity at the end of the age. What they were not expecting was for this resurrection to happen to one person in the middle of the age. So what happened with Jesus is what the Jews were expecting to happen to everybody else at the end of the age. It just so happened to happen to Jesus first within the age, and that has enormous significance for how we live our lives now within this age. So what is the resurrection meaning? What does all this mean to us? How does it affect the way that we live our lives? Well, first, it means that death has been defeated. Jesus entered into the realm of death, and he defeated death. Think of it like this. Think of it like a dark room. If you wanted to defeat darkness, how would you defeat it? You can't turn off the darkness. The only way you can defeat the darkness is by turning on a light. Well, the only way you can defeat death, remember, death is essentially a negation. It is the absence of something. The way to defeat death is to infuse it with life. The moment that Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life, the moment that Jesus entered into the realm of death, death was no longer dead. It had to be alive. He introduced life into the realm of death. And by that, he overpowered it. Just as he says that the light overcomes the darkness. Light overcomes darkness, life overcomes death. So death was defeated. Because of that, the kingdom of God is at hand. We prayed in the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come. As a result of the resurrection, that prayer is in the process of being answered. Redemption of God's good creation has begun. All of this happening because of Jesus rising from the dead. He defeated death, and now he has said we're going to raise the entire creation to life. And all of this was inaugurated into the present age by the bodily resurrection of Jesus, an enormously significant event in history, that if we water it down, it becomes so much less meaningful, and meaning all but disappears. But let me ask you, as we discussed briefly last week, do you believe it? Do we believe that Jesus rose from the dead in bodily form? Do we believe that he left behind an empty grave? Here's the results of some surveys. 25% of British Christians, a survey by the BBC, says that 25% of British Christians do not believe in the resurrection of Jesus. And this is on any level, physical or spiritual. They just simply don't believe in the resurrection. And yet they call themselves Christians. 40% of British Christians believe that Jesus rose from the dead in some fashion, but not as the Bible records it. In other words, they do not believe in a bodily resurrection. Before we take pot shots at the British, according to a Barna survey, 30% of born-again Christians, I presume this is in America, do not believe that Jesus rose bodily from the grave. 30% of people who identify as born-again Christians say they do not believe in a bodily resurrection of Jesus. That's astounding. That's absolutely astounding to me. And then, as we saw last week, 66% of Americans who believe in a resurrection do not believe that they will have bodies, physical bodies, after the resurrection. So they are denying the very thing that Paul was proclaiming in 1 Corinthians 15. These are astounding statistics. It doesn't surprise me, but it does obviously unnerve me. It bothers me. It doesn't surprise me. In fact, there was an article about one of the surveys. I can't remember which one now, but there was an article in which several spiritual leaders were quoted, and I have their quotes here on the screen. This came from the Casper Star Tribune, and it was an article about the various surveys that we just saw. And this one person, John Shelby Spong, responding to the notion that Christians no longer believe in a bodily resurrection, he says this: maybe the old Greek idea of an immortal soul has taken over, and the idea of a resurrected body has fallen into disrepute. Wow. Pretty strong words. I know nothing about Mr. Spong. He's an Episcopal bishop. I probably should say Reverend Spong or whatever his title is. According to the article, he is one who is minimizing the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So he himself has a hard time believing in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Okay, next quote. This one's from Robert Wuthnow from the Center of the Study of Religion at Princeton University, again from the same article that I found online dealing with these surveys. He says, in a way, though, it doesn't surprise me. Again, it doesn't surprise me either. I can think of interpretations of the creeds that would suggest a spiritual resurrection rather than one of the physical body. Now, I don't believe that Wuthnow is minimizing the bodily resurrection of Jesus, but he's not surprised that others would. I mean, it's very easy to look at this language and think in terms of a spiritual soul, if you will, rising from a dead body and going off to a disembodied heaven. It's easy to believe that because that's what Plato believed, and Plato is about 400 years before Jesus, 400 or 500 years before Jesus. So by the time Christianity was starting to get developed, a lot of Platonic thought crept into Christianity. And so, when you've spent, the first 5 decades of your life, as I have, defining resurrection in spiritual terms, when somebody comes along, like an N.T. Wright or many others, Randy Alcorn I mentioned last week, who says, no, this resurrection is a body rising from the grave. And God's not talking about leaving a bodily earth, but rather restoring a bodily earth. When people come along with those types of ideas, it's very easy for us to say, what? What's going on? And some of you may have that reaction to these Sunday school lessons that I'm sharing. But once you see it all, suddenly the whole Bible lights up with meaning. The whole point of Genesis 1, a good creation, now suddenly has meaning. The whole point of resurrection, I see a new heaven and a new earth. And you see heaven and earth joining together. What happened in the fall is that heaven and earth separated. With Revelation, heaven and earth are joining back. It's not that God gives up on the earth, destroys it, and ships us all off to a disembodied heaven. That's not a Christian idea at all. That's a Platonic idea. Okay. And then, to quote the great guardian in the Narnia series, when he was dealing with the four children, what are they teaching? This comes from Al Mohler, president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, again quoted in the same article that I read online. I continually am confronted by Christians, even active members of major churches, who have never heard the bodily resurrection of believers taught in their local congregations. We have a lowest common denominator Christianity being taught in so many denominations that has produced a people who simply do not know some of the most basic Christian truths. And my heart is in lockstep with Al. We have some very basic Christian truths that we're just simply ignoring in the churches. And it's easier to just simply accept the Platonic idea of a spirit going off to heaven while a body rots in the ground. It's easy to do that. Quite honestly, it can be very comforting at funerals. It's just too easy. It's just too easy to buck that tidal wave of teaching and to come back to the real truth that we are looking forward to a bodily resurrection, just like Jesus rose from the dead bodily, and we are going to rise from the dead, and we are going to redeem this earth and transform it. Just as our bodies will be transformed, the earth will be transformed. And that's a much more difficult teaching to accept. And so it's just very easy. All we need to do is get souls saved, get people saved so they're not burning in hell forever. So let's get their souls saved so their soul goes off to heaven, and we've done our job, and we think that's the end of it. But there's a lot more work for us to do. So let me ask another question. And if I was going to say if we were on YouTube, there would be a huge debate. Well, we are going to be on YouTube, but we're going to avoid the debate here. Here's the question. All these people I just mentioned in the surveys, the 25% of British Christians who do not believe in a resurrection, the 30% of American born-again Christians who do not believe that Jesus rose from the dead, the 66% of American Christians who do not believe they're going to have a bodily resurrection at the end of the age. Are they Christians? Put the question a different way. Is belief in the fact of bodily resurrection a prerequisite to being a Christian? We think about this sort of thing all the time. We think about what does a person have to believe in order to be a Christian? And that raises a more fundamental question. What in the world is a Christian? Well, the actual word literally means a little Christ. I mean, that's the literal meaning of Christian, little Christ. Somebody who looks, breathes, and acts like Jesus Christ is a Christian. Well, obviously Jesus believed in a bodily resurrection, so do we need to? Do we have to? Is it a requirement? Is Peter going to stand at the pearly gates of the heavenly city and ask you, do you believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus? And if we say no, he's going to say, sorry, you're going to the lake of fire. I'm not sure. Actually, I do have an opinion. Let's look at where the word Christian actually appears in the Bible. It appears 3 times. The first time is the most meaningful for our discussion, and that's in Acts 11:26. And here it says, the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. The disciples were called Christians. So there's an equation there that a Christian is a disciple. All those people in the Gospels who were called disciples are now being called Christians. And in the Greek, the word disciple comes from the Greek mathetes. Again, butchering pronunciations, forgive me, all you Greek scholars. And the Greek term simply means a learner, a learner. So a person who is a learner following Jesus Christ is a Christian. So what is a disciple? A learner. But the thing we know about learners is that learners don't know everything, especially all at the same time, all at once, when you first come to the study. I'm preparing some courses to be taught at Toccoa Falls College, and there's going to be a progression of learning in my courses. I don't expect my students to come into class on the first day of class and know everything that I know, nor do I expect me to know everything that N.T. Wright knows, or anybody else for that matter. So a learner doesn't know everything, and the learner isn't necessarily going to believe everything that the teacher believes until they come across it and it touches them in their own lives. On this whole question of what it takes to be a disciple, I am reminded of the story in John 9 of the man born blind. And here was a man born blind. Jesus comes along, heals him. The chief priests and the Sadducees and the Pharisees and whoever was involved, and I'm sort of going from memory here, they come to the man and they say, look, we know this man is a sinner. We know this man isn't from God. We know this man isn't the Messiah. And the man who was healed, this is after he was healed, he says, I don't know if he's a sinner. One thing I do know, I was blind and now I see. So here is a man who is saying that he doesn't even know if Jesus is a sinner. And yet he is declaring his faith in this Jesus by allowing Jesus to heal him of his blindness. In fact, we see this a little bit earlier. The one thing that we do know that a true learner does is a true learner lives by what he has learned. He lives by what he knows. A true disciple will live in the way that Jesus lived. So John 9:7, this is earlier in the chapter, Jesus said to him, go and wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And here's what the man did. So he went away and he washed and he came back seeing. So in this, we see a simple, basic obedience. Jesus tells the man to do something. And shock of shocks, the man does it. He doesn't say, why should I do this? He doesn't say, what right do you have to command me? He doesn't say, who are you to tell me what to do? He just goes and he does it. And at that moment, I believe that man became one of Jesus' disciples, a learner. The only thing he learned at that moment was to go and wash his eyes. And so he went and washed his eyes and he came back seeing. And from that moment, he was born again and he continued to grow in learning. If you were to ask that man at that time, is the Son of Man going to rise from the dead 3 days after he's put to death? He would have said, I don't know what you're talking about. If you would have asked him even after the resurrection, was Jesus risen from the dead? He might say, I don't know. I know that I was blind, but now I see. It's a matter of living by what we know to be true. And here I'm going to come back to my hero, George MacDonald. And this is what I believe the best definition of a Christian I've ever seen. A Christian is just one that does what the Lord Jesus tells him. Neither more nor less than that makes a Christian. Later on in a different sermon he wrote, it is simply absurd to say you believe in him if you do not do anything he tells you. This is the thing I love so much about George MacDonald. He had an understanding of what it means to believe in Jesus that was just so basic and fundamental. We cannot say we believe in Jesus if we have no interest in doing what he tells us to do. And that's pretty basic. And so he defined a Christian as somebody who does what the Lord Jesus tells him. Later on, he told us how we could be a disciple. Remember, in Acts, we see that the disciples are called Christians. So in order to be a Christian, we need to be a disciple. And here's George's advice on how to be a disciple. Do you want to live by faith? Do you want to know Christ aright? Do you want to awake and arise and live, but do not know how? I will tell you. Get up and do something the Master tells you. The moment you do, you instantly make yourself his disciple. Obedience is what makes us a disciple. The word disciple, the word discipline, they come from the same root, obviously. And so to discipline ourselves to obey Jesus is what makes us a disciple. It's not that we believe the right things about Jesus. It's that we believe in Jesus. And to believe in Jesus is to obey him. So as I sit here, I'm not going to say that all those people who hold to a Platonic view of their Christianity aren't Christians. I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say it's unfortunate. I'm going to do everything I can to try to teach them, anybody who will listen to me, that Platonic Christianity is not biblical Christianity. I'm going to do everything I can to try to help us change our vocabulary, to use the words the way the Bible uses them. I looked in my King James Version of the Bible, and there are about over 700 references to the word heaven in the King James Version of the Bible. And so far, I have not yet found any one of those references that refers to heaven as our destination after we die. That's not the way the Bible used the word heaven. Now, there is a destination when we die. It's the New Jerusalem on the new earth. That is our destination. We use the word heaven to describe that. And in my view, that's sort of unfortunate because we're using the word heaven differently than the way the Bible uses it. So what I want to do in my own life is to use the biblical words the way the Bible uses them. And so to better understand the truth that God gave these writers to give us. Okay, beliefs and actions. Resurrection, therefore, this whole discussion about the resurrection is not an academic point to debate. That's not my purpose. I'm not here to debate people as to what resurrection is all about. It is about living a life. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul then tells us, this is the very end of the chapter. He's just told us everything about the resurrection, told us we're going to have resurrection bodies, spiritual bodies. That doesn't mean spirits. That means a body that's animated by a spirit. And we're going to live on a new redeemed earth. Therefore, he tells us, therefore, this is the point of the whole chapter. My beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the Lord's work, because you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. The resurrection of Jesus, therefore, gives meaning to our labor. That's what Paul's telling us. The work that we do on this earth has meaning because of the resurrection of Jesus. So, because it has meaning, because it's not in vain, be steadfast and immovable. So this begs the question, what is the Lord's work? What is the Lord's work? For decades, those of you who know me, I spent my career as a lawyer. When I was in college, I was a political science major. I accepted Christ in my freshman year of college. After college, I was torn. Should I go to seminary and seek full-time Christian work, or should I continue going on my current path of becoming a lawyer? So I decided to make it very simple. I applied to both, and I told God, whichever school I get accepted in, that's where I'll go. Well, he threw me a curveball. I got accepted in both seminary and law school. So at that point, I didn't know what to do. Spoke with my parents, got some counsel from them, and after speaking with them, I agreed and I believed it was the Lord's will that I go to law school, which is what I did. Over the next 3 decades of my life, I felt that I had made the wrong decision. And I was beating myself up because for 3 decades I told myself I wasn't doing the Lord's work. the Lord's work was out saving souls from hell, and I wasn't doing that. I was putting people in prison. I was a prosecutor. My job was to try to put people in jail, and I was doing that. And I was defending lawsuits where people were trying to take money from the city where I worked because of what they believed was a wrongdoing. And so I was defending those lawsuits. I was fighting over money. I thought, how can anything be any more secular? After 3 decades of this, after going through a period of 9 months of deep depression, and a lot of soul searching, a lot of studying, a lot of reading, a lot of learning, and reading everything I could get about everything, God made it very clear to me that he had called me to the work of a lawyer. This is a very long story that I'm distilling down in about 2 sentences. But he had called me to be a lawyer. And his message to me was that whatever my hand finds to do, that I should do it with all my heart as unto him as a lawyer. And so I learned to do the work of a lawyer and to do it as best as I could. And I was fairly successful, in part because I worked for a local government, and the law is stacked in favor of local government. But I was happy with the work that I did as a lawyer. And I realized that I was doing the Lord's work. And so with that, let's look at some verses in 1 Corinthians 3. And this is where I believe that Paul is talking about doing today's work in the age to come, or doing the age to come's work in today. Here he says, according to the grace of God, which was given to me as a wise master builder, I laid a foundation, and another builds upon it. But let each man be careful how he builds on it, for no one can lay any other foundation than that which has been laid, which is Jesus Christ. But if anyone builds on the foundation of gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or stubble, each man's work will be revealed, for the day will declare it, because it is revealed in fire. And the fire itself will test what sort of work each man's work is. If any man's work remains, which he has built on it, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, but as through fire. Looking at those words, if any man's work remains, the work is being tried by fire. And as we know, fire destroys impurities and the pure remains. And so there's a sense of the work remaining after the trying by fire. But I think there's another sense in which this phrase, the work remains, is used here. And I believe that what Paul's talking about is that the work that we do in this age, if it survives the trial by fire, it will remain in the age to come. In this sense, we are very much building the kingdom of heaven. We saw back in the early slides that Jesus' resurrection inaugurated the kingdom of heaven into this world. It's here, it's not complete, but I believe that God has given us the work to complete this task of building the kingdom of heaven on this earth. We are not here just simply to try to find a way to escape this earth and go off to a disembodied heaven. We are here given the task of building the kingdom of heaven in this world, in this age. And as we do our work, that work will remain in the age to come. I believe that there's a double meaning there to that phrase, if any man work remains. It's a remaining after the fire, but after the fire is the age to come. So there's going to be work that we're doing today in which we are building the kingdom of heaven. N.T. Wright puts it this way. He says we are building for the kingdom of heaven. I would just like to say it more directly. We are building the kingdom of heaven. And what we do in this world, in this age, will survive into the age to come. And I've got a quote from Wright. This is actually taken from an article in Time magazine that he wrote a couple years ago, dealing with building God's kingdom today. And he puts it this way: historical study, reading the New Testament in its own world, thus brings surprises that can have an impact on modern Christianity too. Perhaps the most important is a new or rather very old way of seeing the Christian mission. If the only point is to save souls from the wreck of the world so they can leave and go to heaven, why bother to make this world a better place? I've got to tell you, for 30, 35 years of my Christian walk, that's exactly the way I felt. In fact, I was reading an article yesterday. Apparently, there's a Harvard professor who's been making some pretty snide remarks about Christians. And one of the things that he said in a recent, I don't know if it was a tweet or an article or blog or whatever, but he made the comment that we Christians are the ones who are pushing hardest to have the economy reopened during the coronavirus. And he says the reason we are doing that is because we have such a strong belief in the afterlife that we don't care about this world and we don't care about life in this world. Now, that's an absurd proposition to make, but that is the perception that we are giving the world. As we talk about the afterlife, as the old saying goes, sometimes we have become so heavenly minded, we're of no earthly good. And the point I want to make here is that Jesus didn't call us to just simply go to heaven and to try to take as many people with us as we could. That leaves us with absolutely nothing to do on this earth other than to win souls for heaven. Now, that's an important task. Don't get me wrong. I'm not denying that at all. But there are a lot of people, a lot of Christians in this world doing a lot of work other than, and in addition to, saving souls and going to go to heaven after we die. There are a lot of people working very hard to make this world a better place. And according to N.T. Wright, that's part of what our mission is. Our mission is, in fact, dealing with this world. He goes on to say, but if God is going to do for the whole creation what he did for Jesus in his resurrection, to bring them back here on earth, then those who have been rescued by the gospel are called to play a part right now in the advanced renewal of the world. And that's how he puts the phrase. I put the phrase, we're building the kingdom of heaven. He talks about an advanced renewal of the world. Same idea. Christian mission includes bringing real advanced signs of new creation into the present world, in healing, in justice, in beauty, in celebrating the new creation, and lamenting the continuing pain of the old. Look at that list of things that this is obviously not an exhaustive list. Things that Christian mission includes, things that Christians do today in this world: healing, justice, beauty, celebrating the new creation. That word justice, that's what I did for 30 years of my career. I did justice. I did everything I could to pursue justice in the courts for my clients and for society. And all that time I was thinking I was wasting my time because I wasn't necessarily saving souls to go to heaven after they died. And yet, looking back on it, I was doing exactly what God called me to do, and to do justice. And in doing so, I was helping to build the kingdom of heaven today in this age. The resurrection of Jesus, again, is not simply a happy ending to the crucifixion story. The resurrection of Jesus is not a story that tells us how to escape earth and go to heaven after we die. The resurrection of Jesus is a story in which Jesus inaugurates the redemption of the entire creation. All creation is groaning, waiting for the revealing of the sons of God. That's us. And the creation is waiting for us to stand up and to do our part to build the kingdom of heaven today, to bring new creation into the present world. That's what the resurrection is all about. And that's how it should affect our lives. God's work can be as profound as leading thousands of people to the Lord in a baseball stadium. And it can be as simple as washing the dishes to the glory of God in your kitchen. So do the kingdom work today. Whatever your hand finds to do it with all your heart, do it with all your soul and all your mind, and do it as unto the Lord. That's the message of the resurrection. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you next week.